It's 5 o'clock, so a warm welcome on this late afternoon, early evening to all of you, students, colleagues, first-timers, returners to this webinar. My name is Jeanette Kohl, and I'm the co-director of UCR's Center for Ideas and Society and the PI of its Being Human initiative, where we emphasize open discourse, critical inquiry, and humanistic approaches to the questions of what being human means in the 21st century. I'm your host for today's webinar, which is the second in a series of expert talks on the war between Israel and Hamas. Last week, we had Raed Al-Omari from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, who's the former executive director of the US Task Force on Palestine and a Palestinian himself. And I found it quite fascinating listening to his deep expertise in the field as a diplomat. And I think we've all come to better understand the tremendous difficulties of any attempt at squaring the circle in the Near East when you're on the ground. Today, it's a particular honor to welcome a distinguished guest from our sister university, UCLA, Professor Dov Waxman, who is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Israel Studies and the director of the UCLA Nazarian Center. He's an internationally recognized expert on Jewish-Arab relations, and he certainly is what I would call a public intellectual. A few remarks on how the event goes for those of you who are with us for the first time. I will make some introductory remarks, then Professor Waxman will speak for about 40 minutes, and we will then transition to the Q&A at around 5:45, 5:50. And I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. Please feed them into the Q&A section as they occur to you, and please try and keep them concise. The meeting will, as usual, be recorded, and closed captioning is available through your Zoom menu. We will be guided through today's event once more by our two dear colleagues from the Department of Religious Studies here at UCR, Muhammad Ali, director of our program for Middle East and Islamic Studies, and Michael Alexander, the Maimonides Chair of Jewish Studies, who will also introduce Professor Waxman. I won't say much, just something that really stayed with me, stuck on my mind from the meeting, from the presentation we had last week, when Al-Omari said that never before in his life and long political career had he seen such a so strongly opposed, I think he used the word bubbles, of hostility, of mistrust, of despair also, two bubbles unwilling to make any form of concessions. And I think he did not just mean the Israeli government on the one hand and the Hamas on the other. I think he was also implying, and probably rightly so, that this war, strangely or not so strangely, magnifies larger global rifts politically, culturally, socially. I guess it's my observation that this war really gets under our skin. Almost everyone seems to have unusually strong opinions. And I think that's why deep expertise is needed more than ever. You see, I'm going to the bat for academic expertise here. And this is what we're going to have today. We're privileged of having this today to listen to someone share his political expertise in the field. And I leave it at that, handing it over to Michael Alexander.
Well, great. It's my honor to welcome Professor Dov Waxman, who is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. He's also the director of UCLA's YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. He received his PhD and master's degrees from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and a BA from Oxford University. His research focuses on the conflict over Israel-Palestine, Israeli politics and foreign policy, U.S.-Israel relations, American Jewry's relationship with Israel, Jewish Politics and Contemporary Anti-Semitism. He's the author of many, many articles and 4 books, including his latest book, The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know. So welcome, Professor Dov Waxman.
Thank you, Professor Alexander and Professor Cole for this invitation. I also want to commend the Center for Ideas in Society for organizing this series, because as Professor Cole was saying, I think, feelings are very raw at this moment. People have been really going through an agonizing time over the last few months for anybody who cares about Israel, for anybody who cares about Palestine and the Palestinians. And emotions are still running high, feelings are raw, and I think it is really incumbent upon us as educators and educational institutions to kind of lean into this and to provide education and an opportunity for kind of civil discussion about this, not to shy away from this issue, no matter how contentious and controversial it can be. And so I commend you for organizing this, and I'm honored to be able to participate in this series that you've put together so well. So what I want to do in my presentation is to kind of step back from the day-to-day and begin to, first of all, discuss why this war began, to remind ourselves why the war is happening. And then I will talk about the consequences of the war so far, the impact that it is having. And then I'll end by speculating about how it might end and what I think should come next. So that's going to be the kind of outline of the presentation that I'm going to give. I'm not going to obviously have time to cover everything. I will try and cover a lot in my remarks, but I'm sure there's lots that I will leave out. And so hopefully I will leave plenty of time for questions, and I look forward to answering any questions that you all might have. So let me begin then with why the war is happening. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of this because, in the day-to-day coverage of the war, we can easily lose sight of why this war began. And it's important, I think, to remember that this is not a war that Israel sought. Israel did not want to go to war. It had no plan to go to war against Hamas. It had no plans to invade the Gaza Strip. The war happened, the war broke out because of Hamas's attack on the 7th of October. That was the horrific event that triggered this war. That was, of course, as we know, the deadliest day for Israelis in the country's history. More Israelis were killed on October the 7th than in any single day during any of Israel's wars, and more were killed than in any previous terrorist attack on Israeli civilians. It was, in so many ways, an unprecedented and unmitigated disaster for Israelis. Israeli civilians hadn't experienced anything like what happened on October the 7th in the country's entire history. Well, not since 1948. The war of 1948, not since then were Israeli communities, civilian communities, overrun. That event is still one that Israelis are kind of living through to this day. It was deeply traumatic, deeply shocking for Israelis. And it was in response to October the 7th that Israel went to war. So I think we have to begin, first of all, with understanding that event before we can talk about the war itself. I won't go into all of the intelligence failures, the military failures, the strategic and political failures that I think contributed to October the 7th, but it's suffice to say for now that it represented a monumental failure of intelligence, of military failure, and a strategic failure for Israel that the attack on October the 7th happened. We know now that Israel ignored numerous warnings and intelligence that such an attack might take place, and was really ill-prepared on the day of the attack, and the IDF was very slow in responding to the attack. So on top of the horror and the atrocities that were committed on that day, there's also a kind of deep sense, I think, of national humiliation, of a deep sense of insecurity that has been provoked, of fear and trauma that has been engendered by the attack on October the 7th. And I would say, as a long-time observer of the conflict, that I was genuinely shocked by what happened on October the 7th. Not shocked by that Hamas would stage a cross-border assault. They've been trying to do that before, but the scale of the attack on October the 7th and the savagery of the violence perpetrated on that day did shock me. I'm certainly well aware that Hamas have been responsible for scores of terrorist attacks in the past, but none were on a scale even remotely close to what happened on October the 7th, when some 3,000 or so Hamas fighters and others not affiliated with Hamas poured over the border, the de facto border between Israel and the Gaza Strip, and then went on to perpetrate horrific massacres and atrocities against civilians, including young people, at a music festival. And it's important, I think, to think for a minute about why Hamas conducted this attack. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of the conflict there, but I want to just focus on, I think, a debate that's still happening as to what was Hamas's goals in carrying out an attack of this magnitude, an attack that we now know Hamas had been planning and preparing for at least 2 years. So this wasn't something just in response to news about the potential normalization of diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, as some have speculated, or just a response to Israel's actions on the Al-Aqsa, in the Al-Aqsa mosque that Hamas has claimed as one of the reasons for its attack. I think there's more to it than that. And now, one explanation given is that the purpose of this attack was only really to abduct Israelis, to basically carry out a massive abduction, to try to capture as many Israeli soldiers or civilians as possible, in the hope that they would be then later traded in exchange for Palestinian prisoners and detainees held by Israel. The argument for that is, of course, that Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of this attack, Hamas's leader in the Gaza Strip, was himself released in an earlier exchange, in an earlier deal that then Prime Minister Netanyahu made to secure the release of the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit. This was a deal that was made in 2011, and at the time, Israel agreed to release over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, including Yahya Sinwar, who was serving multiple life sentences at the time. They released over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for that one Israeli soldier. And so, according to this view, the purpose of this attack was to try to release the rest of those Palestinian security prisoners in exchange for the captured hostages that Hamas was hoping to seize. Now, I think there's no doubt some truth that was a major goal of the attack, was to abduct Israelis. But I don't think that in and of itself is a sufficient explanation. It certainly doesn't explain the atrocities that Hamas undeniably committed on that day, really the savagery of the violence, including sexual violence that was perpetrated, and the fact that that violence was recorded and broadcast for everybody to see. And that's, to me, what I've kind of struggled most to understand, because that kind of violence, which was more reminiscent of ISIS than Hamas, that kind of violence was not Hamas's modus operandi in the past. Yes, they carried out scores of terrorist attacks and suicide bombings and firing rockets into Israel, but never before the kind of, really horrific, gruesome violence that was perpetrated on October the 7th. And so why would Hamas do this, and why would they stage such a massive attack with the knowledge that it was likely to provoke a massive retaliation by Israel? with the knowledge that it was likely prompt Israel to invade the Gaza Strip, as Israel did, and potentially jeopardizing Hamas's rule there. And I think so one explanation, this is the explanation that Hamas have offered, is that, that wasn't in the plan. That violence was not intended. That wasn't what they planned for. That things kind of got out of hand. They overachieved, you might say, and that they were surprised by their ability to hold these Israeli civilian communities. They were surprised that the IDF didn't respond more quickly, and they really didn't plan to commit the kinds of atrocities. Hamas themselves have said those atrocities were not committed by Hamas militants. Now, that may be the case. I'm personally unpersuaded by that, given the video evidence that we've seen of Hamas militants themselves committing atrocities. But I think, that may be one explanation. The other explanation, one that I personally find more persuasive, is that in fact this was a deliberate. The mass killing, the atrocities was deliberate. It wasn't something that was just happened on the spur of the moment by a kind of Hamas militants and others who got carried away. Rather, that this was deliberate, it was planned, it was intentional. And if that's the case, if the savagery of the violence, if the scale of the violence was in fact deliberate and planned, that raises the question, why would Hamas do that? Why would Hamas commit violence on such a massive scale that would be bound to provoke a Israeli retaliation and probably provoke an Israeli invasion of Gaza? And the only explanation that I think for that is that Hamas wanted Israel to invade the Gaza Strip, wanted Israel to attack, that they deliberately tried to provoke an Israeli response or overreaction, if you like. And that isn't something that is unusual for groups like Hamas to do. Terrorist groups often do try to provoke states, to provoke their enemies into counterproductive overreactions. That's something that Al-Qaeda, for example, tried to do when it carried out the attack on September the 11th, 2001. And so I think there is credible, strong grounds to believe that that was Hamas's motivation, that they wanted Israel to invade the Gaza Strip, and they wanted Israel to invade the Gaza Strip, presumably because they believe that they can withstand an Israeli invasion, that they can survive an Israeli invasion. In fact, they may have hoped that Hezbollah, as part of Iran's axis of resistance, would also get involved in the fighting, as Hezbollah have done, but that would force Israel to fight a two-front war and may ultimately lead to Israel's defeat. So I raise this as a possibility because it raises the troubling possibility that this was a war that Hamas wanted to initiate and essentially kind of set a trap for Israel to walk into. And if that's the case, I think it's safe to say that Israel did do as Hamas may have wanted in immediately declaring war against Hamas after October 7th. And this war, as is already now very clear, is unlike any of the previous wars or mini wars that Israel has fought against Hamas. Those were wars that took place in 2008, 2009, in 2012, 2014, 2021. So we're kind of familiar with these, previous escalations or mini wars. This war is already much bigger, much longer, and much more devastating than any of those previous wars. And the reason for that is that Israel's objectives in this war are much more ambitious, surpass the objectives that Israel previously set in those earlier wars. In those earlier mini wars, Israel's goal was to punish Hamas, to inflict a price on Hamas by depleting its weapons arsenals and killing its fighters, or even assassinating its leaders, but leaving Hamas's government in the Gaza Strip in place, leaving Hamas still standing. And there was many reasons for why Israel adopted this approach, essentially aimed at containing Hamas in the Gaza Strip and deterring Hamas, but not seeking to topple its government and not seeking to destroy the organization. This time around, however, Israel has adopted a very different approach. It's not one aimed at containing and deterring Hamas. Rather, it's aimed at destroying Hamas, and it's a much more ambitious objective. Israel's goal is to decisively defeat Hamas militarily. That means basically eliminating its killing its leadership in the Gaza Strip, its commanders, destroying its weapon stockpiles, and dismantling its entire military infrastructure, especially its tunnel system in the Gaza Strip. And in addition to that, toppling or removing its government from the Gaza Strip, so regime change. So this is a much broader set of goals than in previous rounds of warfare between Israel and Hamas. And these goals, at least at the outset, were widely supported by Israelis, or at least by Israeli Jews. There was, I think, a very broad consensus within Israeli society on the need to thoroughly and decisively defeat Hamas and to remove it from power. The belief was that Israel really could not go back to the situation that prevailed on October the 6th, with Hamas ruling over Gaza. It couldn't return to that. One reason Israelis believe they can't go back to that situation is because it will be difficult, if not impossible, to convince Israeli civilians to live in the southern communities, and particularly in the kibbutzim that lie very close to Israel's border with the Gaza Strip. Since October the 7th, something like over 100,000 Israeli civilians from southern Israel, living in southern Israel, have been displaced because of the destruction of their communities on October the 7th. And there's a broad sentiment in Israel that they cannot be asked or expected to return and rebuild those communities if Hamas is still governing Gaza and still able to pose the kind of threat that it did on October the 7th. So that's one reason for waging this war, to remove Hamas from power and to decisively defeat it. Another reason that Israelis have for waging this war is the belief that Israel needs to restore its deterrence, that Israel needs to demonstrate to its enemies that the attack on October the 7th would elicit a massive and destructive response by Israel. Because there was this sense that the attack was this kind of humiliation for Israel. It exposed this weakness that Israel had. It was a massive intelligence and military and political failure. The fear is that this will encourage more attacks by Hezbollah or by Hamas or other militant groups opposed to Israel. And that in order to prevent this, Israel has to demonstrate that its enemies will pay a very high price. And that would in turn help restore Israeli deterrence. So those are two, I think, compelling reasons for why many Israelis, not every Israeli, not Palestinian citizens of Israel, for example, who are much more critical of the war, but why many, at least Israeli Jews, have strongly supported this war for the last few months. Okay, let me now talk a bit about the consequences, the impact that the war is having so far. We're now nearly 4 months into the war. We've passed the 100-day mark. And while we are still living in what the Prussian military strategist Karl von Clausewitz famously called the fog of war, so we're still in this situation where it's hard to really make sense of the progress on the battlefield and who is quote unquote winning so far, I think we are already able to provide some kind of an assessment of the impact the war is having. So first of all, let me start with the impact that the war is having upon Hamas, because as I said, the purpose of this war, the objective of this war for Israel is to decisively defeat and to destroy Hamas. So how's that going? How much progress has the IDF made in achieving that wartime objective? Well, it has been able, so far as we can tell, to gain control over the northern part of the Gaza Strip, where much of Hamas's government was based, it's specifically in Gaza City, which was the kind of seat of Hamas's government. So the IDF has largely conquered northern Gaza, but it's made limited progress so far in destroying Hamas militarily. The IDF claims to have killed at least 9,000 Hamas fighters. But we know that Hamas, before the war began, had something like 30,000 fighters under its command. So if the IDF's estimate is accurate, that around 9,000 to 10,000 fighters have been killed so far, that's only about a third of Hamas's fighting force. And not only are most Hamas fighters still fighting and still alive, but even though their command structure has come under a lot of stress, and in some cases has disappeared altogether, they have regrouped and are fighting in now, it seems, in smaller units like guerrilla forces, rather than operating as a kind of standard traditional army. Israel has been able to assassinate many of the mid-level military commanders that Hamas has, but most notably, it has not been able to assassinate, to kill Hamas's top leaders in the Gaza Strip, especially Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, or Maimonides, the head of Hamas's military wing, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. With regards to Hamas's stockpiles, Israel has the weapons that Hamas has. Israel has said that it has destroyed thousands of these weapons, but it's believed that Hamas still has enough arms to continue fighting for at least a few more months. Israel has destroyed many of the rocket firing capabilities that Hamas had, but Hamas has shown that it's still able to fire rockets into Israel, including deep inside Israel. Just over the last few days, it's fired rockets as far as Tel Aviv, for example. So it still retains that capacity. And with regards to the tunnel network that Hamas has built underneath the Gaza Strip, the IDF claims to have destroyed many of those tunnels, but most remain intact. Even according to Israeli sources, about 80% of the tunnels remain intact. And it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to really dismantle that tunnel network. We're talking about tunnels that are estimated to be between 350 to 450 miles in length. So we're not talking about a few tunnels here. We're talking about a kind of entire subterranean city that exists under the Gaza Strip. In Israel, it's sometimes referred to as the metro system, but it's actually a bigger system than the London Underground or the New York City metro system. We're talking about tunnels that are equipped with elevators, with electrical and plumbing systems. Some have bedrooms and bathrooms, multi-stories. Some are big enough for cars to drive through. And that is really what Hamas is relying upon to survive this offensive and to survive this invasion and be able to keep fighting. So while Hamas's leaders and its fighters are largely protected in this underground tunnel system that they've built up over many, many years, it's above ground where Palestinian civilians are completely unprotected that the war has proven to be most devastating. And it's having really the most devastating impact, not upon Hamas, but rather upon Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. More than 26,000 people have been killed so far, and around 65,000 have been wounded since the start of the war. That's according to the figures produced by the health ministry in the Gaza Strip, which is run by Hamas, but those figures are broadly regarded as reliable. But we don't know within those figures what proportion of those 26,000 or so people who have been killed are combatants versus non-combatants. According to the health ministry, about 70% of the dead are women and children, which really indicates the massive toll this war is taking upon innocent Palestinian civilians. And that's not even counting the thousands of bodies that are still buried in the rubble of northern Gaza, which has largely been leveled. So we really don't know how many more people have died in the war because those bodies have not been reached or counted. Beyond just civilian casualties, more than half of all buildings in the Gaza Strip, that includes people's homes, more than half of all buildings in the Gaza Strip have been leveled, and nearly 85% of Gaza's population of 2.3 million people have been displaced from their homes. Around 93% of the population now face acute hunger. So famine is looming in the Gaza Strip and disease is spreading in the Gaza Strip. According to a recent report by the World Health Organization, the death toll from sickness and starvation in the coming months could actually surpass the number of people killed in the war so far. So basically, I think undeniably, a humanitarian catastrophe is occurring in the Gaza Strip. And this humanitarian catastrophe is only likely to get worse in the days, weeks, and months to come. As a result of the large number of Palestinian fatalities and the massive humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place, many of critics of the war have been accusing Israel of carrying out a genocide. On Friday, just this past Friday, the International Court of Justice in The Hague issued an interim ruling on this charge, which was brought to the court by South Africa. Israel is a signatory of the Genocide Convention, so that is why South Africa took it to the International Court of Justice. And the judges found that that accusation is at least plausible. They didn't rule that Israel is in fact committing a genocide, merely that it is plausible that it is committing a genocide. Now, I personally think that the charge of genocide is unfounded. I think the reason for that is because that a genocide, it requires not just the fact that many people get killed, many civilians get killed, or that a humanitarian catastrophe is taking place. That does not prove a genocide is occurring. For genocide to take place, there must be, quote, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a group as such. Those are the words of the Genocide Convention. And I don't think there is such an intent. Now, I don't ignore some of the reprehensible and shocking statements that have been made by Israeli politicians, including senior officials like Prime Minister Netanyahu and his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who have really made some really reprehensible statements and engaged in some like dehumanizing language. But I don't think we should read from those kinds of public statements official policy. I don't think there is an official policy to commit genocide. I don't think that is the goal. As I said, the purpose, this was not a war that Israel wanted to fight. This was not a war that Israel started because it wanted to eliminate and kill most of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. This was a war that Israel embarked on in response to October the 7th. And I think there isn't this intention to deliberately kill large numbers of Palestinian civilians. So I don't think that charge is a persuasive one, but I do, however, recognize that there are real grounds for suspecting that Israel has been committing war crimes, not genocide, but other war crimes over the last few months. Now, this is a very difficult issue to determine, especially from afar. I'm talking to you from, the comfort of my home in Los Angeles. I'm not there. I don't see what Israeli commanders see when they make decisions about which building to bomb or what strikes to authorize. And I recognize that there is really no way for Israel to destroy Hamas militarily without inflicting massive harm on innocent people. There's no way for Israel to fight Hamas in such a small and densely populated area as the Gaza Strip without killing many innocent civilians, even if Israel was to do everything it possibly could to minimize civilian casualties. And I suspect they're not doing everything they possibly can. But even if they did, there would still be large numbers of civilians being killed. And that's because of Hamas's tactics. That's because Hamas deliberately embed themselves in the civilian population and fight from within, from buildings that house civilians. They store their weapons underneath. They have their tunnels under people's homes. So it's basically impossible for Israel to fight Hamas without killing Palestinian civilians. And in fact, I think that is Hamas's strategy. They actually want to present Israel with that impossible choice that if they respond, they're going to kill civilians, and that's going to in turn lead to international outrage. And if they don't respond, well, Hamas is safe from any Israeli retaliation. So I think, you know, there would be civilian casualties, large numbers of civilian casualties, even if the IDF was making every precaution possible to avoid them. But I also suspect that, especially in this war, the IDF is not making every possible precaution to minimize civilian casualties. And the question here is really, and as I said, it's a difficult question to determine from afar. The question is whether in making decisions about what to strike, the IDF is strictly adhering to the principle of the legal principle of discrimination. In other words, is it only targeting military targets and not civilian targets? I think there is evidence, even President Biden himself said this, of indiscriminate bombing, a bombing that is not just targeting military targets, but is also targeting civilian buildings, including apartment buildings, which would be a war crime. Now, some civilian targets can be targeted if they have if they're used for military purposes, like a hospital, for example. But there's, you know, recently, for example, a university was destroyed in the Gaza Strip, and I haven't heard claims that that university was being used for military purposes. So I think there is some grounds to suspect that in its targeting decisions, the Israel is not solely targeting military targets. It's violating that principle of distinction. Similarly, the principle of proportionality, which holds that you can only use as much force as is necessary to achieve your given military goal, and no more, that you have to try as much as possible to use the least amount of force necessary to achieve your military goal. And again, I'm not a military expert, but from what we've heard, Israel has sometimes been using a very great amount of military force, dropping, you know, 2,000-pound dumb bombs on a densely populated refugee camp in order to kill a Hamas commander, for example. And that raises the question of whether that's a violation of proportionality, that it's using too much force and ignoring or not caring about the civilian casualties in order to achieve its military objectives. I wanted to say a bit now about the impact that the war is having on the hostage situation, because that, I think, is in the minds of many Israelis what is foremost in their mind is the fate of the hostages that Hamas abducted on October the 7th. At the time, there was initially around 246 hostages in Gaza. That included babies, young children, and elderly people. Many hostages were released, around 100 or so, during a brief truce in November in exchange for the release of around 300 Palestinian prisoners and detainees. But there were still more than 100 hostages inside the Gaza Strip, at least, and as well as others who have been killed in captivity. So the hope was that these hostages would have been released or even rescued. I think it's become increasingly clear that they will not be rescued, that the IDF is not going to be able to rescue these hostages. It's true that one hostage was rescued at the very outset of the war, but there's been no hostage rescues since then. The only way the hostages have been released has been through this deal with Hamas. And so there's growing pressure now on the Israeli government to strike another deal with Hamas to secure the release of the remaining hostages. I'm going to return to that in the conclusion of my remarks. But the war is not having the desired effect of forcing Hamas at the moment to release the hostages. In fact, Hamas have increased their demands for the next round of hostages to be released. I also think we have to recognize that this isn't just, although the war is taking place primarily in the Gaza Strip, it's also having major repercussions well beyond the Gaza Strip. First of all, in the West Bank, where Israeli settlers, extremist Israeli settlers, have been trying to exploit the Israeli army's preoccupation in the Gaza war in order to seize more land in the West Bank and forcibly displace Palestinian communities there. And so we've seen a serious escalation in Israeli settler violence over the last few months, which has forced nearly 1,000 Palestinians to flee their homes. This is something that doesn't get a whole lot of attention in the international media. And in addition to that settler violence, at least 185 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli military raids that have basically been aimed at preventing the outbreak of a third intifada in the West Bank. So far, they've succeeded in preventing a third intifada from breaking out there, but there is that possibility, as long as the war continues, that there could be even more violence and disorder in the West Bank. What has gotten a lot of attention, and I think rightly so, is the regional impact of this war. And a lot of attention was focused for the first few months on the Israel's northern border with Lebanon, and particularly the exchange of fire between Hezbollah, Shia militant group that basically controls southern Lebanon, and Israel. Hezbollah immediately kind of came to Hamas's aid and began, a kind of a campaign of low-level or low-intensity warfare with Israel, using both its own fighters as well as Palestinian fighters. And at the moment, though, those hostilities between the IDF and Hezbollah have remained relatively controlled. Hezbollah has not escalated, is not moved to a full-scale war against Israel. It seems that Hezbollah is not interested in doing that. In fact, now the concern is not that Hezbollah might escalate this into a full-scale war, but that Israel might. And that is something that I think the Biden administration are desperately trying to prevent. But it's not just Hezbollah that have gotten involved in this, and Hezbollah were expected to get involved. But more surprising has been the involvement of the Houthis, another group, militant organization that's allied with Iran, that's trained and funded and armed by Iran. And the Houthis, although they're thousands of miles in Yemen from Israel-Palestine, they have gotten very involved, and most recently in attacking shipping in the Red Sea, which is disrupting global trade and even causing inflation now around the world. And this has now, of course, brought in the United States and the British to respond against these Houthi attacks. And just over the weekend, Shia militia in Iraq attacked US forces in Jordan, killing 3 American soldiers. And we haven't yet seen the response of the Biden administration, but I'm sure the United States is going to respond to that attack. It's by no means the first attack that Shia militias in Iraq have been carrying out against US forces in the region. But there is a real risk, a growing risk, that this war between Israel and Hamas will not be contained within the Gaza Strip, but could escalate into a regional war that could draw in the United States and even Iran, and could become, a truly, truly massive war that would be immensely destructive for all sides. Beyond the regional impact of the war between Israel and Hamas, there's also the global impact. We've seen, of course, demonstrations and protests happening around the world, including on many college campuses. But most alarmingly, we've seen a surge of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents taking place, where Muslims and Jews are being targeted, being assaulted, being assailed, accused of one thing or another, and blamed basically for either Israel's actions or Hamas's actions. And so there's a kind of surge of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Palestinian racism that we've seen happening. And it's not just online where we see this most clearly, but it's also leading to real hate crimes. Most shocking was the murder of a young Palestinian American boy in a suburb of Chicago. That's not the only incident. There's been many other incidents of violence. So this war is having a ripple effect across the world, including in our own communities, including right here in Southern California. So the bottom line then, in terms of the impact, the consequences of this war so far, is that it is having massive costs, especially for Palestinians. The price, I would say, being paid by Palestinian civilians in Gaza for Hamas's crimes. Palestinians in Gaza did not carry out those attacks. Hamas did, and they are the one, but it's Palestinian civilians overwhelmingly who are paying the price for Hamas's crimes. Let me now move to the third part of my presentation. I realize I'm running out of time, but I do want to talk a little bit about what might come next, and about how the war might end and the so-called day after, because that's already a subject of much discussion and intense diplomacy. One of the challenges and one of the problems with the way Israel is conducting this war is that the Israeli government has basically refused to present what it envisions for the future of Gaza after Hamas is toppled, assuming Israel does defeat Hamas. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been completely evasive about saying, what Israel will put in its place, what will replace Hamas if Hamas is no longer governing Gaza. Who will govern Gaza? All Netanyahu has basically said is that he and the Israeli government are opposed to the Palestinian Authority governing Gaza, although that's what the Biden administration would like. He's said that he's opposed to any Palestinian rule over the Gaza Strip, and that Israel has to have what he calls security control over Gaza. But he hasn't really made clear what that would look like, or who would actually manage Gaza on a they manage the civilian affairs in Gaza on a day-to-day basis. So that ambiguity about Israel's ultimate objectives in Gaza is opening up space for others to present all sorts of ideas. And we've heard just over the weekend Israeli far-right ministers and politicians calling for Israel to reestablish Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip and basically to return and reoccupy the Gaza Strip. That's not something that Netanyahu, I think, wants. But his evasiveness, his refusal to really present a clear plan is something that's allowing these extremists in the void to present their ideas, and I think is also really frustrating the Biden administration, who want to know what Israel's desired endgame is in Gaza. On the question of how this war might end, I've emphasized how destructive this war is, not only for Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip, but elsewhere as well in the region and beyond. So I think I want to it's hard to imagine how this war might end. And I think anybody who says they know how it's going to end is fooling themselves, because so much can happen on any given day that it's really difficult to predict how things are going to go. But I want to outline in the few minutes I have remaining 3 different scenarios for how this war might end. One scenario, let's call it the optimistic, relatively optimistic scenario, is that Israel, the Israeli government, and Hamas will be able to compromise and reach an agreement on the release of all the remaining hostages from the Gaza Strip in exchange for a long ceasefire. Now, at the moment, the focus of the negotiations that are involving the US, the Egyptians, and the Qataris, the focus is on a 2-month ceasefire. That's what they're proposing to Israel and Hamas. But I think the hope is, even if it's not explicitly stated, that 2-month ceasefire could then turn into a permanent ceasefire. And so that even if it's initially just framed as a temporary ceasefire, that ultimately it would make it much harder for Israel to return to the fighting, return to the war when the ceasefire ends, and that it would give time and space for international diplomacy to extend the ceasefire and turn it into a permanent ceasefire. Or maybe the Israeli government will be pressured to accept a permanent ceasefire. That is another scenario I think is possible. If that's going to happen, that would be the Biden administration. President Biden is really best positioned to demand a permanent ceasefire. He's accumulated huge political capital inside Israel because of his stalwart support for Israel. He's going to Israel in the early days of the war. The empathy that he expressed for Israelis who are about the trauma and the tragedy of October the 7th. He's very popular in Israel right now, and he, more than anybody, would be best positioned to make that demand of Israel. Why would he make that demand? Well, I think the administration and certainly his political advisors are growing quite concerned that that he will lose the votes of young voters, of Arab American voters, of Muslim American voters, and of African American voters in the November election if he doesn't change policy, if he doesn't do something to really distance himself from Netanyahu and the war. And so this may be a way for him to kind of salvage his election prospects in November. Those are two scenarios in which there would be a ceasefire, either demanded by the president, which Netanyahu would very reluctantly comply with, or as part of a broader hostage deal. However, I think the pessimistic scenario, which I think at the moment looks somewhat more likely than those other two scenarios, is really that the war will not end. And I don't mean that it will never end, but that it will drag on at least for the rest of this year, if not for another year, and maybe even longer, because I think there's a real risk that the IDF, as I said, will not be able to defeat Hamas in the coming months, that it will take, even by the IDF's own estimates, many more months, at least another year or so, and that essentially that the IDF will get bogged down in a quagmire in the Gaza Strip, where it will not be able to completely defeat Hamas and will be faced there instead with a long-term insurgency. And what I have in mind there is really what happened when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. And that invasion, which was also broadly supported by the Israeli public at the time, that invasion did succeed in expelling the PLO's leadership from Beirut and from Lebanon. But ultimately, Israel found itself bogged down in Lebanon and didn't withdraw for another 18 years. And it faced a long-running insurgency led by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. I think there's a real danger of history repeating itself in that respect, and in it, the IDF kind of ending up essentially, even if it doesn't want to reoccupy the Gaza Strip, reoccupying the Gaza Strip, or at least parts of the Gaza Strip, and facing a long-running and quite deadly insurgency. So I'll just end by saying, I think to avoid that outcome, an outcome that I think would be disastrous, obviously for Palestinians in Gaza, but also for Israel, I think to avoid that, a ceasefire is necessary as soon as possible. But I don't think we should believe, but I don't think a ceasefire is enough. A ceasefire is just the first step. There needs to be, of course, rebuilding and reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, which, as I said, has been largely destroyed, decimated during the course of this war. But for that reconstruction and the economic rehabilitation of the Gaza Strip to happen, there needs to be a political process as well. It's not just enough to rebuild Gaza, because if you rebuild Gaza without addressing the needs of the Palestinians, without addressing the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you're basically just setting it up for another war down the line. And I don't think any donors are going to want to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza if all of that money is just going to be wasted with another war breaking out in a few months or years' time. The Arab states, particularly the Saudis and the Emiratis, have also made it clear that they will only help finance the reconstruction of Gaza if there's also a political pathway toward the eventual establishment of a Palestinian state. And I think, therefore, that when we think about the future of Gaza, we can't think about Gaza and the post-war Gaza without thinking about the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, without thinking about the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, and more broadly thinking about the need to resolve this conflict. Ultimately, I think what the October 7th attack and this war has demonstrated in the most tragic and terrible manner is that managing this conflict, trying to contain it and keep it on a low flame and ensure that it doesn't escalate, that's a failed undertaking. That hasn't worked. That has led to October the 7th. That's led to the terrible tragedy unfolding in Gaza today. So there needs to be, there's, I think, growing recognition that this conflict continues to have the ability to destabilize the Middle East, if not the whole world. There needs to be a resolution of this conflict. And I think that is raising, again, international interest in trying to bring about a two-state solution. The irony, of course, is that the Israelis and Palestinians themselves are particularly opposed right now to any talk about a two-state solution. Neither side supports a two-state solution right now. But I think there is still possible to chart a pathway toward a solution, which may start with recognition of Palestinian statehood rather than ending with recognition of Palestinian statehood. I will end there. Hopefully I didn't talk for too long and we have plenty of time for questions.
Okay, well, thank you for that extremely candid review. Even amidst the fog of war, what's happening and having some vision moving forward. So I'm going to give you a question, and then Dr. Ali will give a question, and then we'll turn to the audience questions, and we'll see how this goes. Okay, so following your last point, in his final interview, Henry Kissinger said that the October 7th event ended the possibility of a two-state solution, that Israelis couldn't really be expected to move forward, and the Palestinians haven't been moving forward, and he just thought it was over. So you're a student of Israel. What do you think about the possibilities of Israelis ever getting back on tracks toward two states, even in the medium term or even in the long term?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly I think we have to recognize the Israeli public mood right now, which is, overwhelming opposition to two-state solution, to a Palestinian statehood, at least. I mean, this isn't just because of October the 7th. There's been declining support among Israelis and Palestinians for a two-state solution for some time, from, strong majorities on both sides that were once in favor of such a solution. Gradually, the support has dwindled over the years, and now it's only, I think recent survey showed just around 25% of Israelis now support a two-state solution, which is the lowest figure I think there's been since polling began in the 90s about that. And it's understandable why. I mean, Israelis believe, especially because of what happened on October the 7th, that a Palestinian state would be an existential threat to Israel, that, Hamas would, in short order, take over that state and would be able to carry out more, attacks against Israel, and also forge alliances with Israel's enemies like Iran. So there's real, and I think legitimate security concerns about what a Palestinian state would mean. But I think, so there's also a recognition that simply managing this conflict that Netanyahu and others have been trying to do, and saying, well, Israel could could continue to indefinitely occupy the West Bank and indefinitely maintain a blockade of the Gaza Strip while improving its relations with the Arab states, while building its economy, etc. That was a delusion. That the approach of kind of managing the conflict has failed. And so even though in this moment, I think it is next to impossible to ask Israelis to agree on the establishment of a Palestinian state, I think, a different government and a different leader in Israel can make that case on the need to have a Palestinian state. And we're talking about, so I'm thinking about somebody like Benny Gantz, for example, who is currently considered the most likely to succeed to take over his party after Netanyahu. I can imagine somebody like Benny Gantz being a kind of, Rabin-like figure, somebody who is making that argument not from the grounds of, on terms of Israel's pragmatic security interests. And as many members of the Israeli security establishment believe, that ultimately, a Palestinian state serves Israel's security interests, rather than having Israeli forces, for example, deployed across the West Bank, protecting, Jewish settlements, which is, some people have argued, is one of the reasons why the Israeli communities in the South were relatively unprotected. So I don't think we should just look at Israeli public opinion today and say, that's it, game over, it's hopeless. Public opinion is dynamic. We've seen in the past, before the 1973 war, for example, the Yom Kippur War, as the Israelis call it, the Israeli public was overwhelmingly opposed to giving back the Sinai Peninsula. They believed it was far more, from a security point of view, beneficial for Israel to have that land buffer between Israel and Egypt and to control the Sinai than to have a peace agreement with Egypt. That changed. It didn't change overnight, but it changed in the years following the surprise attack in October of 1973. And one of the other things that shifted Israeli public opinion in support of territorial withdrawal was the visit by Sadat to the Israeli parliament. And so what I'm saying is, public opinion responds to things. It responds to leaders making important gestures and statements, like Sadat speaking before the Israeli parliament, but it also responds to arguments made by Israel's own leaders. For the last, many years now, the argument that Israelis have heard is the voice that Israelis have most heard is Netanyahu's voice, which has been telling them repeatedly that a Palestinian state is an existential threat to Israel. I think an existential threat to Israel is not having a Palestinian state, is in a situation where a minority of Jews are ruling over a majority of Palestinians, of non-Jews in this entire area. And we'll very soon, and we're very, very quickly approaching the point where the Palestinian national movement will not demand a state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but rather will make the demand for equal rights in this one-state reality that presently exists. That will be a demand that I think Israeli Jews will strongly resist, because that would put them make them essentially a minority in this one state. But I think it's one that will resonate around the world, including with Americans. And so over time, Israel could find itself increasingly isolated and ruling over a large restive majority. My saying this is something that many Israeli figures have also said. Hamas does not represent an existential threat to Israel. What Hamas did on October the 7th is a result. They were able to do that because of a whole series of military intelligence and other failures. So Israel can defend itself against Hamas, although I would like to see, and I believe Hamas needs to be removed from power. But ultimately, Israel cannot save itself, at least as a Jewish state, by ruling over indefinitely Palestinians. I think that is ultimately what is eroding Israel's legitimacy, and particularly among the younger generation of people around the world who are increasingly thinking of it as tantamount to apartheid.
Okay, so Dr. Ali, you're next.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Day-to-day politics that we see, perhaps, the pessimistic perspective that you're, in the end that you said, I think it is more, I say it is more makes sense. It makes more sense, the pessimistic side of it, because we still have two competing narratives between two worldviews, two radically different views among peoples in the Israels and many in the Palestines and around the world. And one of the things that I think make it so hard to be optimistic is the religious dimension of it. I think this religious dimension is always hidden. It just it's but always there. There are so many conflicts, there are so many wars in the world that could end very quickly. But here we already have, like 100 years and still going nowhere. So what do you think about this? What is the religious dimension of it that makes it so hard for people to have peacemakers among the Israeli sides and peacemakers on the Palestinian sides? That we have some compromise, we have some common ground. What do you think about this? This is some of, just want to raise some of these questions around.
Yeah, I
the
mean,
world.
so I would say, first of all, certainly religion does and has always played an important role in the conflict and is one of the contributing factors. But I don't think we should, think of it as a religious conflict. It's fundamentally a territorial conflict between two national movements. But those national movements have drawn upon religion and use religion for their own purposes, but there are also significant constituencies of religious people on both sides. Now, I think, we can acknowledge the role that religion plays in fueling the conflict, and particularly the way in which conflict over kind of sacred sites like the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the noble sanctuary, the Haram al-Sharif, which is known to Jews as the Temple Mount. Certainly, these issues are some of the very hardest issues to address. But at the same time, I don't think we should assume that because people are religious, they're going to necessarily be opposed to a conflict resolution, right? That in fact, there are also religious peacemakers. There are also ways of promoting and drawing upon the shared religious values of Muslims and Jews and Christians to actually promote peace. I think one of the things, and this also goes back to the question that Professor Alexander asked me, one of the things that's necessary for any solution that's absolutely necessary and a precondition, in my opinion, is to really engage in intensive peace building. As you probably gathered, I'm originally from the UK. So I grew up, in the 1970s and 80s in the UK with the Northern Irish conflict, with the so-called Troubles, as it was called. I remember as a child, having to be evacuated from a department store in London because of an IRA bombing. That was the reality. And many people in Britain, I mean, that was a conflict also fueled by religious passion, sectarianism, and a conflict that was also very, very long. And many people kind of assumed, well, that's never going to end. These two communities are always, Northern Irish Protestants and Catholics, going to be locked in conflict. And now they're not. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's kind of complete harmony and, they're all sitting together singing Kumbaya, but they're not killing each other. And that's my benchmark of success. And that came about, the Good Friday Agreement, which kind of ended the Troubles, or at least moved it toward political disputes rather than violent conflict. That came about because of a massive investment in bringing the two communities together and building bridges between them, including ministers and Catholic priests and Protestant ministers playing a role, using religion not as a source of division and to legitimize violence, but actually to promote reconciliation and peace. I think one of the mistakes of the peace process, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process in the past, is that it was framed as a secular undertaking. It was seen by religious people on both sides as a threat, not only because it involved territorial withdrawal, but it was seen as threatening their kind of religious values as well. And it was framed as something that was, the once Shas leader of the Mizrahi religious ultra-Orthodox party said, peace is for rich Ashkenazim, peace is for the secular, it's not for us. We didn't see the benefits. I think that was a mistake. I think it's important to actually bring in religious voices, respected religious voices, to legitimize peacemaking. But not do it, when you're having negotiations, but do it years before, so you can build up constituencies for peace. So to go back to the question about two-state solution, no solution is possible right now. But I think what I was talking about, a Palestinian statehood, is not the same as a solution to the conflict. You can have a Palestinian statehood and still have the remaining issues that remain to be resolved. Up until now, we believe that all of them, it's a package deal. Palestinians will only get a state once the whole conflict's resolved. I don't think you're going to resolve the conflict in the near term. I think that's going to take a long time, and that requires peace building. But I don't think Palestinians need to wait for the recognition of statehood until the conflict's resolved.
I had my hand up and then lowered it again because you basically already answered my question of the possibility of political peace through long-term religious peacemakers using the influence they have, the religious leaders, on public opinion. And it's interesting because it ties back to last week and what Al-Omari said, that they had completely underestimated the religious potential, really, not just the religious dimension, but that there was a way that they hadn't thought about. They thought this was all about political negotiations, but it was really the climate on the ground is something else. And that's, I think, where the religious leaders have the, perhaps in some incidents, the greater influence.
Absolutely. I would just say one other point about the religion. One of the things that makes this conflict so intractable is the competition, a kind of zero-sum competition for control over holy sites, and particularly in Jerusalem. And I mean the future of the old city of Jerusalem and the holy sites there is probably the hardest issue of all the so-called final status issues to resolve. And one of the reasons why many religious Israeli Jews oppose a two-state solution is that they would lose access to Jewish holy sites in the West Bank, for example, which is really the biblical heartland of the Jewish people. So I think there's ways to manage that by, for example, ensuring access to people, to religious people, to be able to visit, to pray, etc. So it doesn't have to be, if you have sovereignty, that means the other side loses access. I think we have to think about creatively ways of ensuring that religious Palestinians can access shrine sites in Israel, and that religious Jews should be able to pray and access Jewish sites in a future Palestinian state. I don't think it's realistic to expect either side to give up not only sovereignty but also the possibility of accessing and praying at sites that are of such religious significance.
We do have some questions in the chat. Most of them you've sort of addressed. So I'm going to throw another question at you. So you mentioned very briefly the meeting that happened in Jerusalem yesterday or the day before of the settlers that were having their show in that auditorium. I think a recent Hebrew University poll indicates that about 35% of Israelis support annexing and settling Gaza. Now, that's not a majority, but that's a lot of people. It's hard to call that an extreme position when it's a third of the population. So how divided is Israel? Can you help us understand the settler movement? Can you explain or help us understand the state of the anti-settler movement among Israelis? And my real question is, do you see real chances for serious disruption of government or even civil war? I mean, are we facing a kind of Altalena moment?
Yes, I think the existence of a large, powerful, influential minority of Israeli Jews, but a sizable minority, who adhere to a kind of messianic religious version of Zionism, is a threat not only to any resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but to Israel itself. This is a community that has repeatedly demonstrated that the rule of law is of little concern, and Israeli democracy is of little concern. They believe in the supremacy of halacha as they understand it, and they're willing to use extra legal means to achieve their goals. And this is one of the reasons why they've been so successful for many, many years, going back to the settler movement in the 1970s, who, in the establishing a settlement in Hebron, for example. But, the entire, now I don't think it's accurate to say the entire Israeli settlement enterprise is the result of the actions of this minority of, Messianic religious Zionists. But they have been able to, particularly the settlements that are, deep inside the West Bank, the ones and from which some of the most extreme and where some of the most extremist settlers live. So I think that it is clear that these kind of far right extremists are a major threat to Israel as a democracy. And to any possibility of any sort of peaceful coexistence, whether in a one-state, two-state confederation between Israel and they regard themselves, Jews, as the masters of the land, and they're only basically willing to permit Palestinians to live there if they accept Jewish supremacy over the entire territory, over the entire land of Israel, as they see it, which they believe, you know, is the Jewish birthright, essentially. Now, they are at the moment politically empowered because of, in part, because of Netanyahu, because Netanyahu relies and has constructed a government which has essentially put him and the Israel and Israel at the mercy of these far right extremists. They don't represent, in electoral terms, you know, more than probably 20% of Israeli voters, but because of the nature of Israeli coalition governments, and because Netanyahu depends upon their support, they are able essentially to hold Israel hostage. And right now, that means that it's, for example, impossible to talk about the day after and what should happen in Gaza after Hamas is toppled, because they strongly oppose the return of the Palestinian Authority. They're also now saying that they would oppose the release of any Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the release of the hostages. These positions don't represent the majority of Israelis, but we also know from the American context that you don't need majorities. You need sometimes all it takes is a determined minority to override the wishes of a more passive majority. And while I think most Israelis don't support these goals, don't support resettlement of the Gaza Strip or the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, you know, the fact that the current government depends upon these far right parties has given them immense power, and right now they are feeling that and they are wielding that as much as they can. So yeah, I think ultimately, you know, they need that is a threat, an internal threat that Israel needs to address. And I think, you know, one of the reasons why a two-state solution that would involve the mass evacuation of settlements deep inside the West Bank isn't going to happen is because that would provoke most likely a civil war. That would lead that community to basically prevent that, to resist that by all means necessary. And so that's why I think we have to accept the fact that probably it is unrealistic to, in any solution, to require the mass relocation of Israeli settlers to avoid a civil war. Because if Israel, in order for a two-state solution to happen, it's going to require Israel to risk a civil war. It's not going to happen. So we have to come up with a way that's going to avoid that. But I think, you know, with or without a two-state solution, the messianic extremists are these kind of fundamentalists, if you will, are a major danger to Israel as well as obviously to Palestinians.
Shall we read some of the questions from the audience, right? Okay, so we have a number of questions. One, Stephen Brind, would you say that any prospect for a longer-term peace in the region will depend on a change of leadership on both sides of the conflict?
Yes, I can answer that question quickly. Yes, absolutely. There needs to be a new government in Israel. I mean, the Israeli government had lost its legitimacy even before the October 7th attack. Because of its very controversial judicial overhaul. The Israeli government, as I said, which is the most far-right government, or at least depends on far-right extremists in a way that no government has in the past, had really lost public support before the war. And now, you know, and I think it bears some responsibility for what happened on October the 7th. And so, and it's clear that it is unable to make any decision about what should happen in the future because of the influence of the far right in that government. So ultimately, any progress really does depend upon new elections in Israel. and a new government taking power. Now, I think if there were elections to be held, it's very likely that there would be a new government, because this government and the parties that comprise that are unpopular. The Likud party would probably, according to the polls, lose half its seats if there were elections held. And so, yes, I think there needs to be a new government in Israel. And I'm not under any illusions that a new government would be some sort of, necessarily very dovish center-left government. But I think it would be a more responsible and reasonable government than the current government. And on the Palestinian side as well, there needs to be Palestinian elections. There haven't been Palestinian elections for many years, since 2006. And there needs to be Palestinian elections. The Palestinian Authority has completely lost its legitimacy, just as the Israeli government doesn't have much legitimacy. So you need to have new elections for the Palestinians and a major reform of the Palestinian Authority. Abbas is really, needs to become, he's in his late 80s now. He's widely unpopular. He's autocratic. He's accused of corruption. So I think ultimately he needs to cede the stage, whether he can become just like a ceremonial president, and there needs to be a new Palestinian prime minister. But there needs to be major political change on both sides. I think the key to beginning this process starts with a ceasefire, which would probably lead to the collapse of the Israeli government and would then lead to elections in Israel, and ultimately lead to elections for Palestinians as well, because there's no way that the Palestinian Authority could eventually take over running the Gaza Strip in its present form. It needs to be, in the language of the Biden administration, revamped and revitalized. So yeah, there needs to be, and the tragedy for both Israelis and Palestinians is that their leaders are just so bad. And unfortunately, it's very hard to know whether their leaders make decisions in the interests of their nations or themselves.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Well, I'm seeing some questions here that are related to this. So Jacob Greenstein notices that when there tend to be elections in the Middle East, it's often the fundamentalist parties that win because they are organized around gurus. They're organized around religious figures that are, religions are almost pre-organized and ready for democracy. And that goes both ways in terms of the Jews in the West Bank being pretty well organized also. So is democracy part of the problem here?
Well, I don't think we should be kind of fatalistic and assume that, anti-democratic forces or extremists will always benefit. It's true that Hamas won the last elections, the legislative elections that were held in 2006, but they only won a plurality of the vote that was turned into a strong majority of the seats in parliament, but they didn't actually win a majority support, and in many ways it was because of Fatah's corruption, and in some cases there were 2 more secular candidates competing in the same election. So I don't think we should assume that if Palestinian elections were held, Hamas would necessarily win. Certainly, I think many Palestinians are angry about what Hamas is, the disaster that Hamas has brought upon Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. But I think in order to help ensure that Hamas or other Islamists don't win, there needs to be a clear incentive put forward to Palestinians. So they need to say, if you elect this kind of more democratic party, and a party that's committed to peacemaking and is willing to accept the agreements that have been made between the PLO and Israel, then you're going to get a Palestinian state. In other words, there needs to be a real, carrot that Palestinians credibly can believe that they would support then Hamas's opponents. Otherwise, they're going to support Hamas because Hamas represents the armed struggle. And if Palestinians don't believe there's a credible alternative, a real alternative to the realization of their rights, they're going to support the armed struggle, which is what Hamas represents. I think it's often out of desperation, the belief that there is no other pathway available to them, that they are more like, that they support, Hamas's armed struggle. And on the Israeli side, I also think there can be incentive. There also needs to be carrots. The big carrot that can be dangled in front of Israelis is the prospect of complete normalization of relations with the Arab world, the so-called Arab Peace Initiative. It's not going to be persuasive enough for Israelis to be told, well, if you withdraw from the West Bank and make peace, you'll be able to have peace with the Palestinians. The carrot for Israelis, the incentive that does appeal, is full peace with the Arab world, and particularly with countries like Saudi Arabia. So I think if you present these package of incentives, these carrots, and so that there's really something of, and you have leaders who are really able to make this case, not something that Abbas is able to do, and certainly not something that Netanyahu is willing to do, then I think, you can actually have, you could form governments on both sides that would be committed to serious peacemaking. But again, you also have to invest in peace building. If you have elections just by themselves, they're not a panacea. You also need to prepare the ground by really building grassroots support for peacemaking. And I think that's something that wasn't done in the past. But I don't think we should just, be fatalistic and say that, it's always going to be the kind of the extremists who will win because they're the best organized. I think it's just incumbent then upon the moderates to organize better, and in particular to pay much more attention to grassroots opinion than not just focus on kind of top-down diplomacy.
Jeanette, do we have a time for more, or?
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
You should close it out.
I was struck by the fact that both you and our speaker of last week both stressed the importance of American intervention and the Biden administration, that nothing good is going to come of this. It's not really going to move significantly unless America uses its authority in the global, its strong global standing. So now I'm wondering, if Biden hesitates, if we wait too long, we might get Trump. And then what?
That's right.
I mean, that's a scenario that
I think
really
that's
worries
probably
me.
what Netanyahu is waiting for. I mean, he reads them, a close follower of American politics. He thinks of himself as a great expert on America. And although his relationship with Trump isn't as good as it once was, Trump hasn't forgiven Netanyahu for phoning Biden and congratulating him on winning the 2020 election. But nevertheless, if Trump does end up winning in November, then, one of the reasons will be the strong support he receives from evangelical Christians, who are the most pro-Israel constituency in the United States, much more so than American Jews, who are more divided today. And so, I think for the Israeli right and for Netanyahu, that is what they may well hope for, that they don't need to do anything now. And they can resist any sort of pressure from the international community or from the Biden administration, because, they might hope for a different, that Biden will lose in November. And if that happens, I think, I don't have time to talk about all of the ways in which I think the Trump administration made the situation much worse through the years it was in office, and really exacerbated. I think in some ways what happened on October the 7th was partly as a consequence of that, as the feeling that the US and Israel were trying to completely sideline the Palestinians and just ignore the Palestinian issue, and that they were promoting the Abraham Accords and agreements between Israel and Arab states, and completely feeling that the Palestinians could be forgotten about. And in a sense, what Hamas said was, hey, you're not going to forget about us. We're going to show you that we cannot be ignored, and we can do these things, and we're going to make sure that you have no security as long as we can. So I think it'd be very, very damaging for many reasons, but in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict, very damaging if there is a change of government, because Republicans who were once, actually quite more kind of balanced in their approach to the conflict. You think about even George W. Bush, for example, who actually, you know, was a strong supporter of Palestinian state, and put that forward. And you know, you think about other Republicans. This Republican Party is, you know, so staunchly pro-Israel, but not just pro-Israel, they're pro-Likud. They have made an alignment with the Israeli right. And I think that is a danger to Israel in many ways, and to the Palestinians. So there is a time pressure here. I mean, not to mention the fact that, as I said, the risks of regional conflict, of regional war, continue to increase. So I think for all of that is why just allowing this war to play out on Israel's time frame, I think, is a recipe for disaster, and why it is really important to try to reach a ceasefire as quickly as possible. And the best means to do that is through a hostage deal, because many Israelis, although they would be strongly, a ceasefire would be a bitter pill for Israeli Jews, at least, to swallow, because if it means that Hamas isn't thoroughly defeated and destroyed. But that bitter pill, I think, would be easier to swallow if it brought at least the Israeli hostages home, because I think for many Israelis, bringing the hostages home is the number one goal, and that might make a ceasefire. It would still be very controversial, and it would probably lead to the collapse of the government, but that's probably the best hope.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this answer and for joining us here today. I also wanted to thank our two moderators for doing this again. Thank you, Dov, for sharing what I found to be a wealth, you know, of experience in a field that's very difficult to maneuver. I think I was particularly impressed by the clarity of your and a very fact-based description and explanation of what's going on in this highly messy and politically complex situation. Very broad sweep with an incredible detailed knowledge. Thank you very much. So we concluded last week's webinar with, I guess, the idea of a necessary divorce and a two-state solution, with a question mark in brackets. And perhaps we could conclude today's event expressing our hope that things will happen according to your outlined plan A, a long ceasefire, pressure from the US to end this, and a thoughtful plan for reconstruction and rehabilitation. The recording of today's event will be available on YouTube. So if you want to share with friends or want to have a look into it again, please feel free and join us again at the Center for Ideas. Thank you very much, everyone.